The air inside the courtroom was thick, suffocating, a mix of dust, polished wood, and silent judgment. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and yet the space felt eerily empty, as if the weight of what was about to unfold had drained all warmth from the room. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, illuminating the dark-paneled walls like an interrogation chamber rather than a hall of justice. Judge Hamilton sat high on his bench, his robe draping over him like the black wings of a vulture waiting for its prey to stop struggling. His gavel rested at arm's length, but he didn't need it. His presence alone commanded silence. His sharp blue eyes settled on the boy standing before him, a boy so unremarkable in appearance that he should have been easy to overlook. Yet there was something about him. Lucas Ray stood with his hands loosely in his pockets, his posture neither defensive nor submissive. His messy brown hair fell over his forehead, partially obscuring his face, and his dark eyes were unreadable. He wasn't shifting uncomfortably, wasn't looking around in panic like most would in his position. He simply existed, still as a statue, as if the outcome of this trial meant nothing to him. Judge Hamilton exhaled loudly, flipping through a file with exaggerated impatience. Well, he said, his voice laced with the kind of condescension reserved for men who had grown too comfortable in their power. What do we have here? A young man too afraid to speak or just too foolish to understand what's happening? A wave of chuckles spread through the courtroom like ripples on a pond. Lucas didn't move. The judge leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. Let me guess, he continued. You're one of those kids who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. That the world owes you something because you can play around with computers. He scoffed. You're wasting everyone's time. Do you even have a brain in that head of yours, or is it just empty space? The laughter in the courtroom grew louder. People love a public humiliation, especially when it's not their own. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Lucas moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head, dark eyes locking onto Judge Hamilton's with an intensity that was unsettling. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but cut through the room like the first crack of thunder before a storm. If you're done mocking me, Your Honor, Lucas said, tilting his head slightly, I'd like to correct the mistake in your ruling before you send an innocent man to prison. The silence that followed was absolute. The laughter died instantly, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire courtroom. A few people exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had misheard. Judge Hamilton's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then his face hardened. Excuse me? Lucas took a step forward, his posture still relaxed, but his presence suddenly commanding. There's an error in the evidence presented against Daniel Grayson, he said, his voice unwavering. A serious one. And if you don't correct it, an innocent man will be convicted for a crime he didn't commit. The room held its breath. The lawyers at the prosecution table turned their heads so fast it was a wonder they didn't snap their necks. The defense attorney, a man who had looked resigned to losing this case, suddenly sat up straighter. Judge Hamilton stared at Lucas as if seeing him for the first time. His fingers tapped against the wooden bench. And I suppose you, an 18-year-old, believe you know more than the legal professionals who built this case? Lucas didn't flinch. No, sir, he said. I just know when someone made a mistake. For a long moment, the courtroom remained frozen in time. Then the heavy doors at the back burst open. 2 officers stormed in, hands hovering over their holsters. Step away from the bench, one of them barked. Lucas didn't move. His mother, Lisa Ray, let out a gasp from the audience, her hand flying to her mouth. Judge Hamilton's face darkened, confusion flashing across his features. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. One of the officers pointed directly at Lucas. This kid hacked into the court's database, he said, his voice tense. We have reason to believe he's been accessing classified information illegally. A collective gasp spread through the room like wildfire. The murmurs turned into a chaotic buzz. Lucas's heart pounded against his ribs, but outwardly, he remained still. He had expected resistance. He had even expected hostility. But he hadn't expected them to move this fast. The officers stepped toward him, handcuffs ready. Lisa Ray shot up from her seat, her voice trembling. This is a mistake, she cried. My son isn't a criminal. Lucas finally turned his gaze away from the judge and looked at the officers. If you'll just let me explain, he started. Silence. Judge Hamilton slammed his gavel, but his voice lacked the same arrogance it had held earlier. Lucas took a deep breath. He had a choice to make. He could deny everything, pretend he had nothing to do with the so-called breach. Or he could tell the truth and gamble everything. He exhaled and made his decision. Yes, he said, his voice clear. I accessed the case files, but not to cause harm. The room went still again. Judge Hamilton's eyes narrowed. Then what exactly were you trying to do? Lucas held his gaze. To stop you from making the biggest mistake of your career. A beat passed. Then another. And then all hell broke loose. The courtroom had erupted into chaos, but Lucas barely heard it. The murmurs, the whispers, the sharp gasps of disbelief, all of it faded into white noise as he stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Judge Hamilton. The judge, usually so confident, so unwavering in his authority, looked rattled. His fingers twitched as he gripped the gavel, his eyes darting between Lucas and the officers closing in. Lucas had expected backlash. He knew that stepping forward with what he had found would make him a target. But he hadn't anticipated just how quickly the system would turn against him. They weren't interested in hearing the truth. They only wanted to silence it. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, their boots clicking against the polished floor as they grabbed Lucas's arms. The cold bite of steel encircled his wrists, the handcuffs clicking shut with finality. Lisa Ray's voice cracked as she pushed forward, her desperation drowning out the surrounding commotion. This is wrong. You're arresting the wrong person. But her protests were drowned beneath the authoritative commands of the officers, their voices cutting through the air like blades. Lucas kept his head high as they turned him toward the exit. He knew that struggling would be pointless. He had seen it too many times before, the way the system crushed those who dared to challenge it. But he wasn't going to let them walk him out of here like a common criminal without making one thing clear. He turned his head just slightly, just enough for his voice to carry over the noise. If you review the evidence, you'll see that I'm right. His tone was measured, not pleading, not angry, just a simple statement of fact. And when you do, you'll realize that this isn't about me. It never was. Judge Hamilton didn't respond. He didn't even look at Lucas as they led him away. But the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the bench, told Lucas one thing. Doubt had been planted. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him, cutting him off from the chaos he had left behind. The hallway outside was cold, lined with faded gray walls and buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a sickly glow over everything. Lucas had spent countless hours in spaces like these, institutions designed to enforce order, places where control was everything, and those who didn't fit the mold were swiftly dealt with. He had spent enough time watching from the sidelines to understand exactly how this worked. The moment they labeled you a threat, the moment they decided you didn't belong, they moved fast. And right now, he was the threat. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut, tightened his grip on Lucas's arm. You don't look like much of a criminal, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His grip wasn't rough, not really, just firm, just enough to remind Lucas that he was no longer in control of his own movements. Lucas didn't respond. He was too busy running through every possible outcome in his head. They wouldn't just let him go. That much was obvious. The fact that they had moved this quickly meant that someone wanted him silenced, and whoever that was had the kind of influence that didn't leave room for hesitation. The real question was, how far were they willing to go? As they approached the holding area, Lucas's mind drifted back to where this had all started. It had been 3 weeks ago, in the dim light of his bedroom, when he had first stumbled across the case file. At first, it had been nothing more than a curiosity. Lucas had a habit of digging through publicly available legal documents. It was a puzzle, a way to keep his mind occupied. But this case had stood out. Something about the evidence, the timestamps, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument, it hadn't added up. So he had kept looking. What had started as idle curiosity had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. He had found gaps, tiny cracks in the foundation of the case that no one else seemed to notice. The security footage used to place Daniel Grayson at the scene of the crime, it had been altered. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that anyone conducting a surface-level review would catch. But the metadata, the lighting discrepancies, the compression artifacts, it had all pointed to one conclusion. Someone had tampered with the evidence. At first, he had thought it was incompetence. Clerical error. Maybe someone had made a mistake, submitted the wrong file, overlooked a minor detail. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Someone wanted Daniel Grayson behind bars. The realization had settled over him like a weight, heavy and undeniable. He had spent that entire night going over the files again and again, looking for anything that could disprove his theory, anything that could convince him he was wrong. But there had been nothing, which left him with one problem. What was he supposed to do about it? He had tried reaching out to reporters, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. But he was just a kid, a name without credentials, a voice drowned out in the flood of more important cases. No one had paid him any attention. And so he had made a decision. If no one was going to listen to him from the outside, he was going to force them to listen from the inside. Which was how he had ended up here, being led down a hallway toward a holding cell, his hands cuffed in front of him, his future uncertain. The officers pushed open a heavy steel door, leading him into a small, dimly lit room. A single bench lined one of the walls, and the air smelled of disinfectant and something stale, something old. Lucas sat without resistance as they removed the cuffs, his mind already shifting to the next move. He had known this was a risk. He had known that stepping into that courtroom meant putting himself in the line of fire. But what he hadn't expected was just how quickly the system would react. The door clanged shut, locking him inside. Lucas exhaled slowly, leaning back against the cold concrete wall. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating, because now, for the first time, he had their attention. And that meant it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The metal door sealed behind Lucas with a heavy clang, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of the holding cell. The walls were cold and bare, the flickering fluorescent light above casting a dull glow over the concrete floor. The air smelled of antiseptic and something older, something ingrained into the very foundation of the place, the scent of desperation, of countless others who had sat in this very spot, waiting for their fate to be decided by forces far beyond their control. But Lucas wasn't like them. He wasn't here to wait. He was here to force their hand. His mind worked through the situation methodically, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. He had expected pushback, had anticipated some level of resistance, but this? The speed with which they had moved to silence him, the efficiency of it, it told him that someone somewhere had been waiting for this. They had been ready. And that meant one thing. Whoever was behind this had power. Real power. The kind that didn't rely on legal proceedings or fair trials. The kind that made people disappear. The weight of that realization settled over him, but fear never took hold. Instead, there was a clarity, a sharp-edged focus that narrowed his world down to one undeniable truth. He couldn't afford to be passive. Lisa Ray sat in the courthouse lobby, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The noise of the courtroom had been replaced by the low murmur of voices, lawyers in expensive suits talking in hushed tones, security guards moving with trained indifference. She had been left there, forgotten, while they took her son away. No one had given her answers. No one had even looked at her. Lucas had always been different. Even as a child, he had seen patterns where others saw chaos. He had learned how to read people, how to anticipate their reactions before they even knew what they were going to do. And that skill, the same one that had made him feel so out of place among his peers, was the only thing keeping him calm now. He replayed the last moments in the courtroom over in his mind, searching for anything he might have missed. The judge's reaction, the officer's movements, the way the prosecutor had tensed when he spoke about the evidence. He had rattled them. Even Judge Hamilton, who had walked into that room expecting nothing more than a routine sentencing, had hesitated. That hesitation was his opening. The click of the lock snapped him back to the present. The door swung open, and two figures stepped inside. The first was a uniformed officer, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had seen it all and stopped caring about most of it. His name tag read Harris. The second was different. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't wearing a badge, but he carried himself with the same authority, the same presence. His suit was dark, pressed, expensive. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Lucas with an intensity that sent a silent message. He wasn't here to negotiate. The man's expression never changed as he stepped forward, his hands folded behind his back. He studied Lucas as if he were a particularly unremarkable artifact, something to be examined and discarded. Finally, he spoke. "You've made a mistake." His voice was smooth, devoid of any real emotion. The kind of voice that belonged to men who didn't waste words. Lucas didn't answer. He let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of it settle. He had learned a long time ago that people in power hated silence more than anything. It made them uncomfortable. It forced them to fill the void with something real. The man tilted his head slightly, watching him. You think you've uncovered something important? A pause. You haven't. Lucas kept his expression neutral. The man sighed, as if this entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. You're young. You don't understand how things work. Lucas finally spoke, his voice measured. I understand more than you think. Harris shifted uncomfortably beside him, but the man in the suit didn't react. Then you understand, the man continued, stepping closer, that there are rules, and people who don't follow them. He let the words hang in the air, unfinished. Unnecessary. Lucas held his gaze. Are you threatening me? The man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Not at all. He took another step forward. I'm giving you a choice. A choice. Lucas had heard those words before. They were the kind of words people used when they had already decided the outcome. The illusion of free will wrapped in a carefully crafted lie. He said nothing. The man studied him for a moment longer, then exhaled. You're going to stay here for a while. Long enough for the situation to go away. He gestured vaguely with one hand. You'll have time to reconsider your position. To understand that this isn't your fight. Lucas's mind raced through the implications. They weren't planning to charge him. Not yet. They weren't interested in due process or legal procedures. They just wanted him gone. Out of sight. Out of mind. Which meant they were afraid of what he knew. And that fear, that single, undeniable truth, was something he could use. He leaned back against the cold wall, his lips pressing together as if considering the words. He let the silence stretch again, long enough that even the man in the suit shifted slightly. Then, finally, he spoke. Am I free to go? Harris let out something between a cough and a scoff, but the man in the suit didn't react. Instead, he studied Lucas for a long moment, then gave the smallest shake of his head. No, he said simply. You're not. Then he turned to Harris. Move him. Lucas didn't resist as they grabbed his arms again, as the handcuffs locked around his wrists once more, because he had just confirmed something important. They weren't going to kill him. Not yet, which meant he still had time. And time was all he needed. The corridor they led Lucas through was colder than the holding cell, the kind of cold that seeped beneath the skin and settled in the bones. The air was stale, the walls a dull, lifeless gray, as if this place had been designed not just to contain, but to erase. His footsteps barely echoed against the tiled floor, swallowed by the suffocating silence. Lucas didn't ask where they were taking him. He already knew. This wasn't about due process. It wasn't about justice. It was about making a problem disappear. The man in the suit, he still hadn't given a name, walked a few steps ahead, his presence commanding without effort. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. People listened. People obeyed. And those who didn't, well, they weren't around long enough to become a problem. Lucas had spent enough time studying power structures to recognize the pattern. There were men who operated within the system, bound by rules and regulations, and then there were men like this, men who existed above it. The ones who pulled the strings, who shaped outcomes long before anyone else even knew there was a game being played. Harris walked beside him, the uniformed officer's grip firm but not cruel. Lucas could tell the man wasn't comfortable. He had seen it in the way Harris had hesitated earlier, the way his jaw had tightened just slightly when the suit had spoken. He wasn't part of this. Not fully. He was just another cog in a machine too large to stop. They turned a corner, and the walls changed. Gone were the sterile cinder blocks and flickering lights. The hallway they entered now was darker, more polished. Different part of the building entirely. The transition was deliberate, a message wrapped in architecture. Lucas was no longer in a place meant for public scrutiny. He was in their domain now. A single door stood at the end of the hall, unmarked. Harris stopped just outside, hesitating for the first time since they had left the cell. His fingers flexed against Lucas's arm, and for a moment, just a moment, Lucas thought he might say something. But then the suit turned, fixing Harris with a look that made whatever thought had been forming vanish instantly. Inside was all the man said. The door opened, and Lucas stepped through. The room was small. Not an interrogation room, not exactly. There was no two-way mirror, no observation window. Just a metal table, a chair, and a single overhead light that cast sharp shadows against the walls. The kind of room where conversations didn't get recorded, where agreements were made outside the reach of legal proceedings. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality. Lucas exhaled slowly, taking in his surroundings. They had taken off the cuffs before pushing him inside, a calculated move. They wanted him to feel like he had some control, like he was a participant rather than a prisoner. The suit took his time, adjusting his cuffs before lowering himself into the chair across from him. There was no rush, no urgency. He was in control, and he wanted Lucas to know it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "You understand why you're here." It wasn't a question. Lucas tilted his head slightly, considering his response. He could play along, pretend to be intimidated, but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. Men like this didn't respond to fear. They responded to leverage. So he met the man's gaze, unflinching. "You're afraid of what I know." The suit's expression didn't change, but there was the slightest shift in the air between them, a barely perceptible tension. Lucas had struck a nerve. "You've made a lot of noise," the man said after a pause. "More than you realize." Lucas remained silent, waiting. The man sighed, as if explaining something to a particularly slow student. "You believe you've uncovered something important. And maybe in another world that would matter." He spread his hands. "But in this world, there are things you don't get to expose, no matter how smart you think you are." Lucas filed the words away, dissecting them even as they were spoken. This wasn't a dismissal. It was a warning. He was getting closer. The man tapped a single finger against the table, once, twice, the rhythm steady. "This is the part where you decide what happens next." A pause. "We can make this go away," he continued. "No charges. No trial. You walk out of here, and this," he gestured vaguely, "becomes nothing more than a bad decision on your part." Lucas didn't move. There's always an offer. A carefully crafted lifeline designed to make you think you were choosing your own fate. But Lucas had seen enough to know what this really was. A leash disguised as freedom. The suit waited, but when Lucas didn't answer, he let out a soft breath. "You think you're playing a game," he said, his voice calm. "You're not." He leaned back slightly. "You're standing in a place where people disappear." The words were matter of fact, not a threat, just a reality. And yet Lucas saw something else in them. Confirmation. If they had the power to make him disappear, they would have done it already. The fact that they hadn't meant they needed something from him. And that was the opening he needed. Lucas sat back, mirroring the man's posture. "If that's true," he said finally, "then you wouldn't be wasting your time talking to me." The suit's jaw tightened just slightly. Lucas let the silence stretch. Then, deliberately, he leaned forward. "You're worried," he said quietly. "Not about me. About what happens next." A pause. "I'm not the problem," he continued. "The truth is," the man studied him, expression unreadable. Then he stood. For the first time, Lucas saw something shift behind his eyes, something colder, more calculating. "You should be careful with that word," the suit said. And with that, he turned and walked out, the door locking behind him. Lucas exhaled slowly. They weren't done with him. Not yet. And that meant he still had a chance. Lucas remained seated, staring at the door that had just locked behind the man in the suit. The silence in the room stretched, thick and oppressive, pressing against him like a weighted blanket designed to suffocate. His pulse had steadied, but his mind was anything but calm. They weren't letting him go. That much was clear. The offer had been a formality, a test to see how easily he could be manipulated. He had given them an answer they didn't like, which meant the next move would be theirs. Lucas inhaled slowly, counting the seconds as he exhaled. He had learned a long time ago that fear wasn't something you erase. It was something you controlled, something you directed. And right now, he needed his mind clear. Because there was one undeniable fact that kept replaying in his head. They needed him alive. If they didn't, he wouldn't still be in this room. He would have been escorted out the back door of the courthouse, stuffed into an unmarked car, and never seen again. But that hadn't happened. Which meant they weren't ready to make him disappear. Yet, a soft buzzing sound broke the silence. The room was wired, probably recording, maybe even being watched. That didn't surprise him. What did surprise him was that no one had come back yet. He had expected them to move quickly after his refusal, to escalate their approach, but instead, they were leaving him alone, letting the weight of the situation settle in. It was a psychological tactic, one designed to make him feel powerless. It wouldn't work. Instead, Lucas used the time to think. He needed information. The man in the suit had been careful, measured, but he had slipped up. He had confirmed that the problem wasn't Lucas, it was the truth. Whatever he had uncovered wasn't just a mistake in a court case. It was something bigger, something worth burying at all costs. But who was pulling the strings? Lucas closed his eyes briefly, recalling every interaction he had observed in the courtroom. The way the prosecution had reacted when he spoke up. The hesitation in Judge Hamilton's voice. The way the officers had moved with practiced efficiency, like they had been prepared for this moment long before it arrived. Someone had orchestrated this. And if he was going to survive, he needed to figure out who. The door clicked open again. This time, it wasn't the suit. A different man stepped inside, taller, broader, wearing a police uniform. His badge read Captain Morris. The name wasn't familiar, but the look in his eyes was. He was here to play a different role. Morris shut the door behind him and leaned against it, crossing his arms. He didn't sit. He didn't offer any pretense of civility. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low and controlled. Lucas didn't respond. Morris sighed, pushing off the door and stepping closer. "Listen, kid, you're in over your head. You think you're exposing some grand conspiracy, but you don't understand how this works." Lucas tilted his head slightly, watching him. The captain continued. "You're not a threat. You're an inconvenience. And right now, there are people who are trying to decide what to do with you." Lucas remained silent, waiting. Morris exhaled sharply. "I'm the last person standing between you and something you won't walk away from." There it was. The escalation. Lucas knew how this game was played. First came the manipulation, the illusion of choice. Then came the intimidation. And if that didn't work, well, then things got ugly. He could feel the shift in the air, the barely restrained tension. Morris wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to issue a warning, to give Lucas one last chance to comply before the situation changed. Lucas met his gaze evenly. "Then tell me," he said, his voice calm, "who are you protecting?" A flicker of something passed through Morris's expression, annoyance, maybe, or something deeper. A warning flashed in his eyes, but he didn't answer. Lucas leaned back slightly. "If I wasn't a threat, you wouldn't be here." Morris's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're up against." Lucas let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "Then tell me." A pause. For a moment, it almost seemed like Morris might. But then he exhaled sharply and stepped back, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Lucas didn't answer. Morris turned toward the door, but hesitated before opening it. "Last chance, kid. Walk away now, and this ends." Lucas didn't move. Morris let out a quiet curse under his breath before stepping out, the door slamming shut behind him. Lucas exhaled slowly. They were running out of patience. That meant he was running out of time. He needed to act before they decided he wasn't worth keeping around. His mind raced through possibilities. He had no access to a phone, no way to contact anyone outside these walls. But that didn't mean he was out of options. They had taken him here for a reason, which meant the answer wasn't outside. It was in this building. Lucas stood, his pulse steady as he walked toward the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening. Footsteps, distant but steady. The hum of fluorescent lights. The faint sound of a conversation happening somewhere down the hall. He took a slow breath, and then he started looking for weaknesses. He didn't need an escape. Not yet. He just needed a way to shift the game in his favor. And if they thought he was just going to sit here and wait for them to decide his fate, they had underestimated him. Badly. Lucas had always been good at finding cracks in a system. It was what had led him here in the first place, an ability to see what others missed, to recognize patterns where others saw nothing. And now, standing in the middle of the small, dimly lit holding room, he was looking for the cracks in his own captivity. Everything about this situation screamed control. The room itself was designed to strip a person down, to make them feel small and powerless. No windows, just a single, heavy door. No distractions, nothing to hold on to. Just four walls meant to press in on him until the weight of silence did the rest of the work. But control was a fragile thing. It only worked when people followed the script. And Lucas had never been good at following scripts. His first step was simple: gather information. They had left him in here alone, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. He ran a hand through his hair, casually shifting his gaze toward the corners of the room. No obvious cameras. That meant if they were monitoring him, it was through an external feed audio, most likely. He had to assume that every word, every breath was being recorded. That was fine. The real issue was time. They wouldn't let him sit here indefinitely. The man in the suit, Captain Morris, whoever was running this operation, would make a decision soon. Either they would try to make him disappear, or they would find another way to shut him down, which meant he had to move first. Lucas stepped closer to the door, tilting his head as he listened. He had spent years training his brain to filter noise, to separate meaningful sounds from background distractions. The hum of the fluorescent lights was constant, the distant murmur of voices down the hall faint but steady. But then, there, a small, almost imperceptible vibration. The sound of footsteps approaching. He took a slow breath, stepping back just as the lock clicked. The heavy metal door swung open, and Harris entered. The officer looked tired. Not just physically, but in a way that told Lucas he was caught between orders and his own conscience. "Come on," Harris muttered. Lucas didn't move right away. He studied the man's face, the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed slightly at his sides. This wasn't routine anymore. Something had changed. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked. Harris exhaled through his nose. "You ask too many questions." But Lucas noticed that he didn't meet his gaze. That was confirmation enough. Something was wrong. Lucas followed him out of the room, his mind racing through possibilities. The hallway was empty, quieter than before. A bad sign. Silence in a place like this meant things were happening behind closed doors. Deals being made. Decisions being finalized. They turned a corner, and Lucas's stomach tightened. There were no other officers in sight. No security cameras here either. Just an unmarked door at the end of the hallway. A door that shouldn't exist. Lucas slowed his steps. This isn't the way back to the holding cells. Harris hesitated just for a second before gripping his arm more firmly. "Keep walking." Lucas's pulse spiked, but outwardly, he stayed calm. He had expected this, just not this soon. They were cutting their losses, deciding he was more trouble than he was worth. Whatever evidence he had found, whoever was behind this, they had decided to eliminate the problem, which meant Lucas had minutes, maybe less, to turn the situation around. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. Panic was useless. He needed an opening, an opportunity. Harris stopped in front of the door and knocked once. It opened immediately. The man in the suit was waiting inside. No pretense this time. No careful words. Just cold, quiet efficiency. Harris let go of Lucas's arm, stepping back slightly, his shoulders tense. He wasn't the one in control here. The suit gestured to a chair in the middle of the room. "Sit." Lucas didn't move. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed the man's face. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Lucas met his gaze evenly. "That's funny," he said. "I was about to say the same thing." A pause. Then the suit exhaled, stepping forward. "Let's not pretend you have leverage here." Lucas's mind worked quickly. He had to shift the power dynamic before they made their final move. "You think getting rid of me solves your problem," Lucas said, keeping his voice measured. "It doesn't." The suit arched an eyebrow. "No." Lucas shook his head. "Because I'm not the only one who knows." The room went still. It was a gamble, a bluff, but one backed by logic. The people behind this operation had treated him like an anomaly, a lone problem to be dealt with. But if they thought the information had already spread, that eliminating him wouldn't be enough, then suddenly their calculations changed. The suit studied him for a long moment. Then finally he smiled. "You're lying." Lucas held his ground. "Are you willing to take that risk?" Another pause. Then, the man in the suit turned to Harris. Take him back to holding. Harris hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the change in orders. But then he nodded, gripping Lucas's arm again. Lucas allowed himself a single breath of relief. They weren't done with him yet, which meant he still had a chance. As Harris led him back down the hallway, Lucas felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had just bought himself time. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. The hallway was just as empty on the way back as it had been when Harris had led Lucas toward what should have been his end. But now everything felt different. The air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating, and each step Lucas took felt like it was placing him deeper into quicksand. He had bluffed his way out of immediate danger, but that was all it was but delay. A calculated risk to buy himself time. Time for what, though? That was the question clawing at the edges of his thoughts. They weren't just going to let him sit in a cell forever. The suit had made that much clear. They had considered making him disappear, and now they were forced to reevaluate. He needed to give them a reason to let him live. Harris's grip on his arm was looser now, but there was something else in the way he held himself, something cautious. The officer hadn't spoken a word since they left that room, but Lucas could feel the tension radiating off of him. Harris knew. Maybe he didn't know the full extent of what Lucas had uncovered, but he knew enough to recognize that something was wrong, that he was involved in something much bigger than what they had told him. As they reached the end of the hallway, Lucas glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. Harris was frowning, his fingers tightening slightly. A hesitation. Crack. Lucas stored that information away for later. The heavy door to his cell swung open, and Harris ushered him inside without a word. The door slammed shut behind him, locking Lucas in once again. He exhaled slowly, forcing his body to relax. His mind was already racing through options. There was no way to communicate with the outside world. No phone, no access to a computer, no way to get a message to anyone who might be willing to listen. He had been completely cut off, which meant his only option was to manipulate the people inside this building. And Harris was his best bet. Lucas sat down on the cold bench against the wall, pressing his fingers together as he thought. He needed to be careful. If he pushed too hard, too fast, Harris would shut down, and any chance of getting him to help would disappear. He needed an opening. A sign of doubt. Something. The minutes stretched into hours, and still, no one came. They were waiting for him to break, to second-guess himself, to start doubting whether he had really made the right call. Lucas didn't break. Instead, he focused on every detail he had gathered so far. The security in this place wasn't as tight as it could have been. That told him something important. This wasn't an official detainment facility. If it had been, there would have been cameras in his cell, strict protocols, layers of bureaucracy keeping him locked in. But there was none of that here, which meant whoever was running this operation wasn't interested in following procedure. And that meant they were vulnerable. A soft knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. Lucas straightened as the door creaked open slightly. Harris. The officer stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were full of conflict. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, finally, Harris exhaled through his nose. What did you do? Lucas studied him carefully. This wasn't just curiosity. It was something more. You already know, Lucas said quietly. Harris frowned but didn't deny it. Lucas leaned forward slightly. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. A long silence stretched between them. Then Harris ran a hand over his face. He looked tired. More than that, he looked trapped. Lucas recognized the signs. You're in over your head, Lucas said softly. Just like me. Harris's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. That was all the confirmation Lucas needed. I don't know everything, Harris admitted after a moment. But I know enough to see that this isn't right. His voice dropped slightly. This was supposed to be simple. You were supposed to be another kid who got caught hacking into something he shouldn't have. Lucas met his gaze. But I'm not. Harris exhaled sharply. No, you're not. There it was. The opening Lucas had been waiting for. They were going to kill me, Lucas said, watching Harris's reaction carefully. A flicker of something in his expression. They still might, Lucas continued, his voice steady. Unless I give them a reason not to. Harris shifted uncomfortably. You shouldn't have come to that courtroom. I didn't have a choice, Lucas said. An innocent man was going to prison because someone tampered with evidence. Harris hesitated. You sure about that? Lucas didn't even blink. Yes. Another pause. Then Harris sighed, looking away. There's more to this than just one case, isn't there? Lucas nodded. Harris ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Lucas leaned forward. Help me. Harris stiffened. That's not how this works. Then change how it works, Lucas pressed. I know you're not like them. Harris let out a humorless laugh. Kid, you have no idea what I am. Maybe not, Lucas admitted. But I know you wouldn't be standing here if you didn't want to do something about it. A long silence stretched between them. Then Harris sighed. I can't get you out. Lucas had expected that. Then give me access. Harris frowned. To what? Lucas's mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. Anything. A computer. A phone. A way to reach the outside. Harris hesitated. Lucas pressed forward. I don't need you to take down whoever's behind this. I just need you to give me a chance. The silence stretched so long Lucas almost thought he had pushed too hard. Then Harris exhaled sharply. You get one shot, he muttered. One. Lucas's pulse spiked, but he forced himself to remain calm. That's all I need. Harris shook his head. I hope you're right. Then he turned, opening the door. As he stepped out, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Be ready, he muttered. Then the door shut behind him. Lucas exhaled slowly. The game had changed. Now he just had to play his next move carefully. Lucas sat in the dimly lit cell, every nerve in his body wired with anticipation. The promise Harris had made was a thin thread of hope, one that could snap at any moment. He knew better than to trust easily, but he also knew that Harris was his only way out. There was something in the officer's voice, reluctance, hesitation, maybe even guilt. And guilt was a powerful motivator. Time was slipping away, though. The suit wouldn't wait forever. At some point, they would decide that Lucas was more of a liability than a problem to be solved, and when that happened, his life expectancy would shrink to minutes. He needed to act before they did. The room was silent except for the occasional hum of fluorescent lights, their glow casting long shadows on the floor. He focused on every detail, every sound beyond the thick steel door. Footsteps irregular, which meant they weren't patrols. Doors opening and closing somewhere down the hall. A muffled conversation, too distant to decipher. Then, the soft click of a lock. Lucas barely had time to prepare before the door swung open and Harris stepped inside. He moved with purpose, but there was tension in his jaw, the kind that suggested he was walking a razor-thin line between doing his job and betraying everything he had sworn to uphold. Without a word, he tossed a small device onto the metal bench beside Lucas. A phone. Burner model, cheap, nothing traceable. Lucas stared at it for a fraction of a second before picking it up, his fingers closing around the cool plastic. You have 5 minutes, Harris muttered, his voice low. No more. Lucas nodded, already scrolling through his mind for the number he needed. There was only one person he could call, one person who might be able to pull him out of this before it was too late. His fingers moved quickly over the keypad, pressing each digit with precision. The line rang once. Twice. Then a voice answered. You better have a damn good reason for calling me from an unregistered number. Lucas exhaled sharply. I need your help. A pause. Then the voice on the other end softened. Lucas. His chest tightened. Yeah. Another pause. Where are you? Lucas hesitated. He couldn't say too much over the phone. He didn't trust that they weren't being monitored. Somewhere I shouldn't be, he said carefully. And I don't have much time. The person on the other end understood immediately. Tell me what you need. Lucas's fingers tightened around the phone. I need proof. Silence. Lucas, I know I already have enough to take them down, but it won't mean anything if they get rid of me first, he interrupted. I need something bigger. Something that forces them to back off. A long pause. Then the voice said, Do you trust me? Lucas closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Then hang up and wait. The call ended. Lucas lowered the phone, his pulse hammering in his ears. Harris watched him carefully. What now? Lucas met his gaze. Now we make them panic. The next hour was the longest of Lucas's life. Harris had slipped the phone back into his pocket and left, locking the door behind him. Lucas sat on the bench, his mind working through every possible scenario. Then, just as he started to wonder if the call had been a mistake, the alarms went off. A sharp, blaring siren tore through the building, followed by the frantic sound of boots pounding against the floor. Shouts echoed down the hallway, clipped orders from voices laced with tension. Something had happened, and Lucas knew exactly what it was. His contact had done their job. The door to his cell burst open, but this time it wasn't Harris. It was a different officer, his face red with barely restrained frustration. "Move," the man barked. Lucas stood, his pulse steady even as his mind raced. They weren't taking him to another room this time. They were taking him out. Down the hall, past other locked doors, past offices filled with officers scrambling to respond to whatever had just happened. The building was in chaos. Lucas caught a glimpse of a news broadcast playing on a mounted television in one of the rooms. His name was on the screen, and so was the evidence. The files he had discovered, the corruption he had uncovered, it was all there, exposed for the world to see. His contact hadn't just given him leverage. They had detonated the entire operation. By the time he was shoved into a transport van, Lucas knew that it was over. Not for him. For them. And as the van pulled away, sirens still wailing behind him, Lucas finally allowed himself to breathe. He had won. For now.